And now we come to the final part of this morning's presentation, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bernadette Wren, formerly of Tavistock Center, who is going to talk to us about Can Evolutionary Thinking Shed Light on Gender Diversity, a View from the Clinic. So we're moving firmly into the clinical arena. Dr. Wren.
Thank you very much. Not formally of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, but currently. It's taking two kinds of courage to give this talk. One is that this is such a contested field now, and we, as a service, I work in the Gender Identity Development Service, where we care for children and adolescents with gender variance. It's become such a contested field that I'm habitually start any talk by really just making a plea for a kind of civil discourse, really. I'm sure this group is too scholarly and civilized to conduct itself in ways that would lead to any kind of really unpleasant exchanges, but I am really quite used to that, and it now is important to say that my own position is to be really curious about this question and not to be taking a particular stand on it. The second kind of courage it needs is that I know quite a lot about gender identity development. Clinically, I'm no kind of expert on evolutionary theory. So this, there is a sort of speculative quality to this talk that I hope will be received in good part by yourselves. As I say, this is such a contested area and such strong feelings, such polarized feelings that are aroused by it, that any claims to certainty, either about the origins of gender variance or the best management, certainly of children, but also of adults. The claims to certainty are common, but actually there's very little strong sound empirical base for any such claims. So given that, it might seem very foolish to come here and consider gender diversity from an evolutionary perspective, especially as perhaps in circles outside this one today, evolutionary perspectives themselves often evoke very strong feelings for and against. So today I'm only going to ask if evolutionary thinking can illuminate our understanding of gender diversity and transgender experience, and the answer might be no. I don't want to propose in any way an overarching evolutionary theory or framework, nor to supplant other emerging ideas for understanding gendered lives that are unconventional. So as I say, it's to offer some provisional hypotheses about how evolutionary processes might play a part in determining an individual's sense of their own gender, brackets, whatever that means, close brackets, and so add to some understanding of this increasingly manifest, increasingly visible aspect of human experience. There's also a hope, maybe it's a faint hope, that rather as the last talk ended, there is a wish to consider whether this kind of perspective could contribute to reducing stigma and discrimination, which is often associated with trans identities, and to lowering the temperature in some of these polarized debates. So we'll see. I'll say something very briefly about the clinic for the clinicians in the room, and as a setting for the thinking that I do. So clinicians in a range of settings, children and adolescent settings, are becoming accustomed to meeting with people who question the assignation, their assignation as male or female. They may not be questioning the visible biology, but they're questioning either the hidden biology, as it were. They're certainly questioning the assignation of gender and gender roles, insofar as they embody a set of expectations about how somebody will live and how they will feel about being in the body. So people are increasingly expressing what was perhaps once hidden, intense distress about being confined within a sexed body, and, as I say, the role expectations associated with those bodies. And now they're a group protected under the equality legislation in the UK of 2010, which means that their entitlement to live in their preferred role has come to be widely respected in education, in health, and so on. Of course, gender-diverse feelings aren't a novel phenomenon. They can be a familiar part of childhood development. But what's new is the numbers coming forward, the intensity and urgency of their expressed discomfort with the body, the demands made for physical treatment, and the often unconditional certainty held by individuals, and in the service where I work, the parents and advocates around these children. They're often assertive support for social and physical transition. These are new and have led us into deep controversy. So at GIDS, the service I work in, the Gender Identity Development Service, the ethos has always been broadly affirmative in the sense that we take seriously the intense and subjective feelings around gender and the deeply unchosen nature of those feelings for the young people who come and see us. And we are very curious about how young people have come to feel as they do, and we don't assume a psychopathological causality. Although we keep an awareness of situations where the gender distress may be secondary to trauma or emotional conflict, without losing sight of the possibility of unconflicted trans and gender diverse experience. It's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I certainly want to acknowledge that we serve effectively as gatekeepers to medical intervention for children and young people, both to treatment which is for suspension of puberty and later on within a framework in which there are certain conditions applying for sex hormones if they wish to enter the puberty that they did not naturally grow up into. So I won't say too much about that today, all of which is controversial, but it's not the point of my talk. I do want to acknowledge that this work has been, or this thinking has been done with a group of colleagues, some of whom have been or were, but not all, attached to the Tavistock Clinic. And we formed a group of people who were interested in the interaction between evolutionary theory and psychotherapy. And I just want to put their names up here. Annie is in the room, so Annie is going to help me with any of the questions later on that are way too challenging for my level of knowledge. But I'd also like to acknowledge Michael Rees, who's at the Institute of Education, Professor of Science Education there, John Lorna, who used to work at the Tavistock Clinic, and Graham Music, who is a child psychotherapist also at the Tavi. These are my co-conspirators in this work. I've got a slide here. We can never talk about gender identity, gender diversity, gender roles without having, we could spend an hour arguing over the language, really. So I'm just putting up a slide that tells you how I'm using the language today. I'm not going to go through them all. It's really just to say, yes, the language is contested. This is where we are at the moment. We're often accused of political correctness if we change our language, but I think most areas of activity around minority groups, the language shifts because it is freighted with meaning, usually disparaging meaning. So I don't apologise for the fact that we take on new terms. Gender, I'm saying, a composite term, that's important. It has many dimensions, if you like, referring both to a deeply held sense of self as male or female, and increasingly, for more and more people, as neither or as both, and society's perception of one's sense and sex roles. So it is at least a two-sided concept, and obviously that it can be at odds with one's assigned sex at birth. I'm just going to mention the two terms of sex and birth-assigned sex. This is often deeply disputed. At one level, we know that sex, traditionally understood as the categories of male and female, into which humans and many other species are classified as a result at birth of what's visible about their genitalia. We use the term birth-assigned sex, and it tells us something about that it is even the assignation of sex, or maybe don't want to say assignation, deciding, if you like, what sex is a baby at birth is already the beginning of the process of gendering. And I think that the term birth assigned sex is just a way of acknowledging that. Okay, we can always come back to other terms, non-binary, somebody who doesn't exclusively identify as male and female, so on. Cisgender, an individual who does identify with a phenotypical sex, and so on. Okay, come back to that. Okay, it seems reasonable to assume that evolutionary theory is of relevance to these matters, since issues to do with sex and procreation, leaving enough offspring, lies at the heart of evolutionary biology. And at the same time, the actions of some trans people maybe seem to be inconsistent with this, whereby each of us strives to maximize the number of healthy, reproductively capable offspring or other relatives that we leave in surrounding generations. And while we need to resist the conflation of sex and gender and the incorrect assumption that gender identity can be equated with sexual identity and sexual behaviours, it's certainly true from an evolutionary perspective that what appears to need explaining is that some transgender people, although not all, make life choices that are likely to reduce their individual reproductive success. And these include the choice to reject a life in the birth assigned sex and gender role, and instead opt for a life lived in another or no gender, and in many cases taking sex hormones and accessing surgery that may reduce or nullify their conventional capacity to reproduce biologically. Obviously, even though medical technologies such as gamete storage with subsequent IVF may nowadays be able to counteract such consequences. I'll try to question such a limited picture of transgender lives through an evolutionary lens, taking account of, as you'll see, sexual selection, social selection, and cultural evolution. So what is gender diversity? It's often assumed to be a foundational condition of animal life that there are two types of sexed bodies, and therefore two ways only of being in the body, male and female. But across the whole of biology, that's an assumption that probably has little substance. There's a distinguished evolutionary scholar and herself a trans woman, Joan Roughgarden, whose book you may be familiar with, in which she presents a compendium of information. It's an enormous literature review, in a sense, on sex and gender diversity in the natural world. And I'll only hint at a few of the illustrations she gives, where animals do not follow what you might call traditional sex roles or behaviour, where the male attempts to impress the female and the female chooses her mate and so on. So she draws on evidence from fish, birds, primates and other mammals to challenge the kind of assumptions, for example, that an organism is solely male or female from life, that sex is only for reproduction, not pleasure, that females, not males, only give birth, that males have XY chromosomes and females XX chromosomes, that males and females look different from each other, and that compared to males, females prefer monogamy. Now, what is the point of these illustrations when what we're talking about is gender identity, which, whether it's congruent with your sexed body or incongruent, is a conscious feeling, a sense of self, and it seems very likely that it's a feature of human experience only, or perhaps a very small number, and this is something one could argue over, a very small number of other species who could be said to have an identity at all, a sense of themselves and in their place in the order of things, if that's what we think an identity is. But I think the point about Roughgarden's comprehensive overview is the idea that we should be cautious about treating nature as binary, as is sometimes assumed, and that, especially in relation to the sex of bodies and sex roles and sexual behaviours, that in so many ways nature tends towards diversity. And this seems a really corrective, illustrative picture in this, as we've said, very, very hot debate. So, among humans, there are obviously situations where an individual has sexual several variations in sex anatomy, and including chromosomes and gonads and sex organs and so on. And these are intersex people. And again, this is something that's widely disputed, the figure. There are people who draw on a conservative figure. Quite famously or notoriously, Fausto Sterling came up with a figure of 1.7% after an extensive literature review of 50 years of research in this area, about people who definitively don't fit the binary male-female pattern. Despite that, most societies have found ways of identifying and segregating the sexes according to visible bodily signs. And this is the process that we call gendering, where we treat male and female people as distinctive with respect to a host of psychological and behavioural characteristics. Yet there's little evidence across many eras and cultural contexts that a settled and unconflicted cisgender identity is for many other than a concession to normativity in social contexts that impose quite rigid sex differences. So it's possible to see conventional gender not as an inevitable outcome of biological difference between males and females, but as a complex developmental achievement, and at least in part as a social construction. Diverse gender identities, as I'm sure you're aware, have been documented across his societies and historical time. These include the Hegiras of India, often thought to number around 1 million people, Two-Spirit people in Native American tribes, the Mahu in Polynesia, and so on. And the literature on this subject illustrates that how diverse and atypical within those communities people may feel and present. There are distinctions within those groups as well as across those groups or between those groups and more typical people. And the roles and behaviours, some of them will be highly valued, thought to have a priestly, a spiritual function. For other people, they can be the lowest of the low. And for some, symbolic or actual surgical alteration of genitals is carried out, others not. Nowadays, in Western societies, Europe and North America, more and more people, as I said, are challenging this rigid articulation of the sex-gender binary prescribed by culture and voicing this incongruity with their sex at birth. For those people, as for all of us, gender identity is often registered not as something that's an achievement, that's kind of evolved over time. Often people feel it, and it would be interesting to see how people feel about their own gender identity, people in the room, as an absolutely core part of themselves, as unshiftable. A deep expression in some way of your core true self. And there are certainly people, clinicians working in this field, who do talk in terms of a true self. Whether they feel that's a biological truth or a psychological truth, I think varies between people. There are also, though, plenty of people, gender diverse people, who question all conventional categories of sex, gender and sexuality in favour of a recognition of much more fluid lives, identities and practices. And of course, many people are contemplating alterations to non-anomalous bodies. These are not people, the young people I see in the clinic, do not have identifiable pathologies of the body, as I'm sure you know. And there are some young people, even who identify as non-binary, who wish to make some of those changes to the body. They want to go some way down that road. And then stop at a certain point. And so there's a more sense of wanting tailored changes to fit with a sense of who they are. Just again, a bit of context to put you in the picture. How common is gender diversity? This is a study, international study, 2015. You'll see the figures here, roughly 4.6 in 100,000. These are figures for people who come to gender identity. These are for adults. These are people who come to gender identity clinics. So it tells us very little about trans or gender diverse identities in the population of people who don't come for help. And actually, for a lot of these studies, they're actually people who meet a threshold for diagnosis, usually gender dysphoria in DSM-5. With children, I've just got this kind of dramatic slide to show you the increase in numbers. From 2009 is when the service I work in became nationally commissioned. In the UK, that means that people can be referred and there is no cost, as it were, to the referrer's service. As you will see from that point on, the figures have grown and continue to grow very dramatically. I think we had nearly 3,000 referrals last year of young people. This is a very quick slide because this is a very controversial topic, to say that referrals by birth sex, by sex of assignation, if you like to use a politically correct term, is changing. This is a slide for all the ages. It would be more dramatic if I showed you, I'm not taking time to do it, but a slide of younger people versus adolescents. Basically, you get more of a 50-50 split between birth-assigned males and females appearing in the clinic in the early years, and as the years go on, majority of our young people are adolescents when they come to us, but the proportion of birth-assigned as females, so young people born as girls, is much higher now, probably about 75% of our referrals. Just raises more questions about what's going on and who are these young people. Okay, and this is just to remind you, gender dysphoria, the diagnosis, most widely used one, marked incongruence between one's experience and so on and so forth. I put this slide on really to make the point that not everybody who's experiences atypical gender identity in any of its forms experiences distress as well. And the diagnosis is supposed to be for people who experience distress, but that's probably for another talk. Okay. Studies tracking some of these young people, as I said, the state of the empirical research is poor, whether about the origins or about the treatment of people who go on to seek physical interventions. Most studies suggest that adults who go through medical interventions, including surgery, do well. I think that's on my earlier slide, a little bit about that. No, it doesn't. Okay, not sure I got a slide on that. Okay. With a degree of continuing mental health difficulties, but as measured by the existing research studies, very small amounts of regret. Amongst children and adolescents, there are some studies tracking, these are Dutch studies, following a small group of young people across time, again, who are doing extremely well through puberty suspension, cross-sex hormones and surgery. But this was, in fact, a very well-functioning group at the beginning. They tended to come a bit later and so on and so forth. I just want to say that coming to clinics, you will see an amazing diversity in presentation. I don't want to go through each point, but I think I just want to make the point that a range of identities, gender presentations and self-descriptions gets wider all the time. As society opens up and listens with different sort of ears, young people present very differently. The amount of distress with the body, the fixed or fluid nature of the identification, the presence of psychosocial difficulties or not. Some young people are doing fantastically well. They're thriving, by any norms of child and adolescent development. The relationship between gender identity and sexual attraction and sexual activity, indeed. Some young people think of themselves as agender. So I just put this up to say that there are likely many pathways to gender diversity. We haven't tracked them, but these kind of picture suggests that. Okay, so evolutionary arguments. Right, let's just touch a little bit about sex and sexual behaviour again. Ever since Darwin, it's been appreciated, obviously, that the key to evolutionary success via their inherited material, their genes, is to leave partial copies of themselves in future generations. Let's not... I'm going to choose my words with care here because I don't want to leave too many hostages to fortune. But Evolutionary biologists, whether concerned with human or other species, tend to assume that any feature of the organism's life, including its sexual behaviour, will have as its end, although not intentional end, the production of offspring. Now, obviously these arguments reached a climax in the 70s and 80s and so on, and there was an assumption that almost everything had to be seen in that light, that everything of interest about human behaviour was a result of the same evolutionary forces. Obviously there's a fight back against that, and we're in a place where we can talk about evolutionary forces possibly operating on sex and gender identities without assuming to be too reductionist about the meaning and value of these behaviours, and they're both their evolutionary and, if you like, their psychological value and purposes. So I'm just kind of nodding towards that in this sort of whistle-top tour. So again, not wanting to conflate in any way homosexuality and gender atypicality, recent debates about the possible evolutionary understandings of same-sex sexuality may be illuminating. Obviously, like gender dysphoria, we assume that homosexuality has existed throughout history and in all known cultures, despite occasional protestations to the contrary in some circles. But it's likely that exclusive homosexuality is quite rare statistically. There's certainly evidence that female sexuality is quite fluid across the lifespan, and that gay men and lesbian women are parents of more children than is sometimes supposed. Research began, I think, seriously in the 70s and 80s. One of the names is LeVay, in 1991, a famous study, about whether same-sex attraction could have a biological basis, namely differences in brain structure. And a debate began that continues to this day about whether sexual orientation might be heritable to some degree. As well, and it's important to say this, a debate about the possible motivations behind these kind of scientific investigations. And those concerns are still there today. And part of what gives this debate, both about same-sex sexuality and about gender identity, such intensity, is the fact that influential scientific persons and bodies confidently embraced existing fixed models of meaning and use their kind of regulatory gaze to impose those models on aspects of human experience and development about which we still know very little and are probably deeply complex. So I just want to say that I think the search for causes in both these fields risks being oppressive and threatens to undermine the autonomy of people who are not problematizing the way they feel, and whose lives are being explained in ways that can be quite prejudicial. It can seem that to look for explanations of sex and gender minority experiences requires not only that they be understood, but that they be open to prevention or suppression. Okay. There are theoretical models of the likely architecture of genes that might influence human homosexuality, and these predict that individuals exhibiting both same-sex and opposite-sex sexual behaviours should be common. You could expect this. And there are some adaptive hypotheses for same-sex behaviour in the literature, positing that same-sex attraction may have wider benefits in terms of enhancing friendship and bonding, mutual assistance, social inclusion, and diminishing intersexual aggression, and might confer a reproductive advantage to relatives of gay people. So obviously we're here, as I was sort of reiterating, not equivocating the concepts of purpose and value between evolutionary value and social value. So what's the evidence for biological factors in the development of gender diversity? Well, we might expect some gender diversity to exist either at a simple gene level, unlikely, or in a more complex gene-environment interactions. Again, there are people who would feel that research in this area, I hinted at the beginning, might reduce stigma for trans and gender diverse people, and particularly by highlighting, not simply it's not our fault, but that it would emphasize the dichotomous rather than continuous nature of gender identity. Although obviously I would want to stress that it seems inconceivable that a trait as complex as atypical or typical gender identity will be found to be determined at a single locus or even a small number of loci. The question is whether it's perhaps possible that interactions between many loci, together with certain features of development, either pre-birth or in the first few years, govern gender diverse expression, experience, and behaviour. And studies have shown that most complex traits are multifactorial and polygenic, obviously meaning that hundreds and thousands of genetic variants, each with individually small effects, contribute additively to trait variance, along with other non-genetic factors. So I think we would probably hypothesize that gender identity is complex, multifactorial, and polygenic. And this, of course, is the model, in a CAMS-type setting where I work, that has shifted our conceptualization of traits like autistic spectrum conditions. And I would say that about a third of the young people we see at the service have features of autism, autistic spectrum conditions. Certainly not all diagnosed, but have features on screening questionnaires. Okay. Most of the evidence about heritability of gender identity comes from studies, from some twin studies. Obviously, the rationale of studies being that monozygotic twins, being genetically identical, share all genetic effects, while dizygotic twins share an average of 50 of their additive and 25 of their non-additive genetic effects. In a recent literature review, Polderman et al., it's a 2018 review, they found 11 studies, 4 with adults, 1 with adults and adolescents, 3 with children, and 3 with children and adolescents. And all but 1 included birth-assigned male and females, if people are interested in pursuing that. Obviously, we have to take a lot of, I have to take a lot of caution in looking at these studies. The heritability of any given characteristic is not a fixed and absolute quality. Its value depends on a number of factors, such as the particular population of people, of individuals sampled, the condition under which they're measured, and I would add, particularly as a psychologist, how that quality or characteristic is measured. And I think we need to be really cautious, even concerned, about the way gender identity is measured in some of these twin studies. Many run the risk of conflating non-conforming gender expression, say in children or as adults remember it, with a sustained transgender or gender diverse identity. Others use very one-dimensional, very stereotypical, very binary constructs of masculinity and femininity, whether they're using questionnaires or whether they're actually asking parents to complete something like the child behaviour checklist that has a couple of little questions about gendered identity and behaviour. That these kind of constructs are deeply culturally embedded, and I think, just want to really put a caution in about that. For example, play activities checklist used in one of these studies reported the judgment from the CBCL of whether the child behaves like the opposite sex. And that's, such a kind of loaded idea for a parent to be making that judgment about a child certainly in 2019 in a society that's more open to gender roles. Anyway, the results of these studies very, very, very briefly suggest heritability estimates of around sort of 28 to 40% for the monozygotic twin correlations and half that for the DZ twins. Some found similar figures for male and female assigned. Others found heritability for masculinity somewhat higher than for femininity, if you want to ponder on that one. Many of the studies have very wide confidence intervals. And there appeared to be a negligible role for shared environmental factors and a small potential role for unique environmental factors. Okay, enough on the twin studies. A flavour only of other research. No evidence from genetic studies in the synthesis of steroid hormones found in some intersex populations, or presentations, I should say. No evidence that they play a role in the prevalence of gender dysphoria. There's a good summary paper by Muller et al. In 2017. Interesting and suggestive work by Melissa Hines suggests that if girls with, people may know, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, sort of overproduction of androgens in utero, in XX chromosome babies, is that if these children, if these girls, mostly raised as girls, have boy-like toy preferences, this is less because they're sensitive to, it's because they are less sensitive to socializing cues about what's considered to be gender-appropriate play, behavior, and toy choices. Okay, so the root of the biology is a really interesting one, played through cultural expectations and children being completely cued to what is, or less so, to what's expected of them when they go into the toy shop or the playroom. So how we see nature, here we see nature determining not so much the choice itself, but the girl's response to nurture. Okay. There's also been some work on temperament. This is Ken Zucker in Canada before his clinic was shut down. Some of you know, I talk about polarization and danger. That activity levels more closely aligned with a child's asserted gender than their sex as assigned at birth. So female-identified boys less active. Finally, I don't really want to get into male brain, female brain research. I'm sure many of you may be familiar with the controversies about that. Again, we could spend a long time arguing about the brain as a unitary organ that could be seen as either male or female. But there is quite a lot of research looking at whether transgender individuals have certain brain structures more closely aligned to their experienced gender than to their sex assigned at birth. And these are some post-mortem studies. Very small numbers of brains have been worked on. A particular type of nuclei has been the target of this, most notably the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. And this is seen to be similar in size for male to female transsexuals to that of control women than to men who are biologically male and happy, as it were, to be so. And most of the studies around different aspects of brain anatomy, structure, functioning tend to present a really uncertain picture. In some studies, trans men look like men who are born into that sex and contents to say so. Other studies, it's equivocal. Other studies suggest the other end of the spectrum. So I think there are new forms of imaging coming through. I'm sure this science is in its infancy, and there will be more interest in it. There's quite a bit of work on white matter connectivity. Again, that's I read the results as equivocal, basically. So the role of biological factors in the development of gender identity, I think, is still unclear. Research is very fluid, changing rapidly. But I think to account for a strongly felt unwilled in human capability like gender dysphoria, as I've said, we need multiple level explanations where the social and biological intersect. We may find that for at least a subsection of transgender people, gender identity may be predisposed genetically, let's not rule that out, but also biologically enacted in the brain and enhanced or suppressed by cultural pressures and individual choices. And of course, one of the problems about identifying a biological marker for, it's okay, don't worry, for something as complex and variant as gender variance, is that you begin to narrow down the group of people who might be entitled to treatment, that only if you present with a biological marker are you seen as a sort of validatable trans person, and everybody else is. So I think there are kind of dangers, as I'm really threading through my talk with that possibility, that the science brings risk with it to autonomy and a kind of human right perspective. Evolutionary basis of gender diversity. I know that time is getting short. If gender identity diversity entails for at least some trans people a reduction in their chances of procreation, and if it does have a genetic component, it suggests that it must be biologically adaptive in some way, either on its own or because of its association with some other fitness-enhancing trait, since it has persisted over such long periods of time. Obviously, I say suggest because biologically non-advantageous traits can exist. For example, evolution always lags behind challenges in the environment, and we've been hearing about that today, earlier. However, such considerations usually apply to relatively minor features of an organism's identity, anatomy or behaviour, not to such major features as reducing the chances of leaving progeny behind. So the question is whether there might be selective forces that could lead to gender diversity and its persistence. So while transgender people who make choices for reproductive surgery cannot, through conventional sexual intercourse, have their own genetic children post-intervention, they may still have quite high reproductive rates because they may have become parents prior to accessing the interventions. But also, we briefly saw that the value of sex and mating behaviour is not only reproduction. And indeed, one of the standard critiques of crude evolutionary thinking, that it seeks to reduce everything about human behaviour to questions about survival and the number of offsprings, is to employ evolutionary thinking as too blunt an instrument. Okay. Another consideration is that while a cisgender history might seem to be optimal for reproductive success in a stable and unchanging environment, if the environment is unstable and undergoing alteration, it might be advantageous for some individuals not to be tied to the same genetic program as the majority. And in such a world, is it possible that genotypic diversity in a group of humans leads to greater stability? A question obviously raising the whole issue of group selection, where traits that are possibly disadvantageous to individuals within groups may persist if they allow the groups to which such individuals belong to survive. Don't want to get into the controversial nature of some of these arguments, but it could mean that gender diverse inclined cisgender people might be seen by some as more attractive mates. And we know that women often do admire men who are not tied to conventional male gender norms, but seem, in our current society, contrary to stereotype, warm and caring, expressive, good communicators and so on. And males often admire women who are tough and brave, independent and so on, against the social norms of what women should do and be like. And it may be that these gender non-conforming qualities in cisgender people can be thought of as signifying genetic superiority under certain conditions. So a genetic bias towards gender diversity would thus be part of a beneficial genetic variability. And this argument is obviously one that historically trans people would have faced extinction, but for being bolstered by a corresponding advantage to the social groups to which they belong. And this in turn implies that human populations hold a reservoir of the versions of the genes that contribute to gender diversity through an evolved capacity for flexibility in gender identity and the adoption of a socially sanctioned gendered behaviour of the other sex. I want to say a bit about cultural evolution, and I know that's not often popular in these kind of settings, but obviously it's a significant other hypothesis for the historical and social pervasiveness of gender diversity, so that it's not a matter of biological evolution at all, but of cultural evolution. It implies that in humans the mechanisms of evolution have to a large extent transferred to the social or cultural level. And slower methods of variation and natural selection give way to speedier processes of acquiring and transferring information and ideas. This is Richardson's definition of culture as information capable of affecting individuals' behaviour that they acquire from other members of their species through teaching, imitation, and other forms of social transmission. Okay. So if social evolution has a mechanical analogue to inheritance as its driving force, it is indeed imitation. And so it's imitation alongside self-consciousness, which can itself be a survival strategy, that has allowed for the creation of a valuable and in some ways useful enhanced repertoire of sex and gender expression. And in this light, we might see gender diverse inclined individuals as adapted not to physical environmental demands, but to the social demands placed on them. And this means that culture, as well as our personal histories, play a big part in the pattern of our gendered behaviours and desires. We could use the language of robustness and plasticity here, I'm very aware, to consider the extent to which individuals with the same genotype may respond to their environments in innumerable and qualitatively distinct ways. And within one framework, we could see the category of gender dysphoria serving as an invitation to bring a set of feelings, beliefs and ideas and experiences into a particular form of coherence. That we humans are makers of shared social meaning, and we seek frameworks to help make sense of feelings such as social unease and bodily dissatisfaction. And it's possible that for some young people, perhaps especially adolescents, there may be particular complex social forces shaping the formation of an atypical gender identity, including forms of anxiety, social isolation and disgust at pubertal changes. And sensitive exploration may be required to assess the likelihood that it will settle and endure in its current form as the individual enters new settings and has new experiences. Attempts, I think, to impose a binary between biological evolution on the one hand and social evolution on the other are unlikely to succeed. So whatever the relative importance of biological and social evolution and the nature of the interactions between them, it's certainly the case that in our interconnected age, which our young people are growing up in, where new ideas emerge and are replicated at massively great speed, we're seeing a generation of young people who are now almost routinely asking themselves if they are trans or differently gendered, to explain their feelings of body alienation and discomfort, and they're resistant to cultural norms of male and female behaviour and heteronormative sexuality. So if we consider the concept of fit with the environment, we might see how some individuals with a predisposition to gender dysphoria, for whatever reason, genetic or social, let's leave that in the air, may come to feel that they would be better matched with their environment if they were of a different gender. Indeed, attempt to be a different sex. And it may be hard to disentangle the elements that have led to such feelings and to make ethically sound clinical decisions based on them. I'll stop there.
Thank you for a thoughtful and sensitive presentation of a controversial contemporary subject. Any questions? Can I ask, if you can, to focus on the evolutionary aspect of it first? The gentleman there, yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just wondering if, I mean, you touched in part on the sort of evolutionary arguments. Do we need to seek any evolutionary explanation at all for the occurrence of mismatch between experienced gender and assigned sex, given its frequency? I mean, it seems to me that all evolved systems are probabilistic, and in a sense, if those two things match in 95% of cases, that's probably about what we ought to expect natural selection to be able to achieve, given that development is complex, environments are complex. These are very complex systems that need to be put together by unfolding in a developmental environment. So in a sense, what's the null hypothesis here? That do we need to reach for a particular evolutionary explanation when something happens rather rarely?
Well, I only ever come and do talks if I think I'm going to learn something from coming from them. So partly what interests me is the response of people who know more about evolutionary theory than I do, about whether this is a kind of meaningful or urgent question. I suppose the field of gender identity studies is very torn itself between what kind of explanation, as I've said, both fits the existing research and gives dignity and validation to people who feel this way, while also allowing that some people will evolve and change. So I suppose I absolutely take your point. I think my sense is a search for where we settle most comfortably with the kind of narratives, whether they're etiological narratives, about these young people in our society. And I'll take your thoughts away. I don't want to take up a different position on that right now.
Sticking to evolutionary perspective. No, related then further down.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was wondering if you, I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned that many of the young female people in your clinic exhibit signs of autism spectrum, and you also mentioned this potential phenomenon of female lack of responsivity to social cues of gender. And I was wondering whether those two together can be bridged to play into some sort of, whether somehow this is related to the evolutionary conversations around autism spectrum disorder and something like that.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments about that? Thank you.
No, I think it's an incredibly fruitful area of research. I don't think we're seeing research at the moment that is a kind of respecting the diversity, I suspect, either in the picture of, I mean, there's been some studies that, in fact, that we did as a service with Simon Baron-Cohen in Cambridge, looking, using one of his questionnaires that divides people between systemizers as more male-oriented and empathizers as more female-orientated. You might be aware with that, Mr. I think it's a very blunt instrument to look at our young people with. But I don't think it's so much about, I think the problem with that kind of research is that you're already in the world of stereotypes rather than standing back from that and thinking, what about the processes? And I think the awareness, it's a two-sided thing. One, you're pointing to, which is, as I came to it with the Hines study, is the awareness of social cues, and there's also a psychological dimension, a sort of bloody-mindedness about not ignoring them. But there's also, what goes with that is a sense of not fitting in. So many of the young people we see have a sense, not simply of alienation from the body, which is another whole area of experience, maybe for autistic children at puberty is very challenging, but that they feel different, they feel like outsiders, they feel unlike other girls in their class, they don't know how or why, and that may be a feature both of their autistic features and their gender development. So I think this is a place to really go.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a follow on to Daniel's point, actually, about whether an evolutionary explanation is required. I would say the extremes of any adaptation and, if you like, the errors that evolution can cause or selection is capable of is in itself an evolutionary explanation, even though it's a kind of negative one. But it's a better explanation than not having it. But I think the evolutionary approach would prompt us to think about the heterogeneity of the phenomena of gender diversity. That's one. The extreme of any adaptation can actually lead to a move away from the typical phenotype, let's say. But also, what are your comments on the issue of mismatch? Because you touched on culture, and I was wondering whether certain cultures or certain cultural content can actually create mismatch with certain traits that certain individuals have that may create gender dysphoria more in some people than in others, more in some cultures than in others. Or maybe even whether human culture itself, as a phenomena which is unique to Homo sapiens, may create the mismatch in all humans.
Well, yeah, so how long have we got? I mean, I think in relation to the previous question about autism, I think just to reiterate something about would be one good example of exactly that. That young people with autistic traits find the struggle into puberty and the change of the body, and very alarming. So we touched on that. Whether or not there are aspects of our cultural world that are in some sense amplifying the likelihood of more gender dysphoria, and that we need that kind of culture-wide explanation to explain these figures, I think is a really, it's a really important question, because I think as a service we're kind of on the back foot really in relation to these numbers. I suppose I think this is all speculative, and I think it's always very difficult to be, especially if there's a camera running, to make speculations when you have a job like mine. But I do think there are issues about, and many people have raised these, about the entry of young women into the stage of sexuality and being sexual beings in the culture that we have, in a culture that's both still very deterministic about those things and yet very aware of the disadvantages of those. So I think there is a particular, and I think one of the issues of diversity is that I think we might be talking about different pathways of people who are born into female bodies and born into male bodies, that there may be, if we're looking culturally, we may be looking at different kinds of points at which life presents itself as very, very difficult and frightening for people in male bodies and people in female bodies, and that may be something really worth understanding, because that could really get a grip on young people, I think, that the turning away from the expected gender roles, because they are now perceived as aversive for large numbers of young people. And we could think about all the ways in which this culture makes adolescence more difficult, and not to overplay that. But yeah, I think absolutely, I agree.
First, I'd just like to say thank you for a very eloquent and comprehensive talk on what is a very challenging subject, and also how well you've handled quite difficult questions, to be honest with you. So I'm going to go a little bit off-piste, so thank you for letting me to do so. So given the kind of evolving socio-cultural and political environment around very challenging subjects like this, how do you feel it will affect kind of ongoing research directions in the future, and critically how we help people or patients that might pitch up to clinics in the future?
How we might, what was the very last sentence?
How it may direct research in the future?
Yes.
And how it might help us to help our patients?
Yes. I don't, the trans lobby often looks very powerful if you read the Daily Mail. I don't think it's actually that powerful when it comes to directing research. So I think there are lots of research endeavours that will roll on. There's also a lot of the research on brain differences is actually the preferred area of research for some trans advocacy bodies who feel that's the way to, as I was saying, to validation. I suppose one of the things, and just picking up on what Hayley was saying earlier, is the question about suffering, I think, and pathology. And what's the problem here, and who's got the problem, and what is it that needs to be understood? So is it the people who suffer and wish it were other? Are there those people out there? Is the suffering only created by the social setting in which people are made to feel this is a very bizarre and sick way to lead your life or something, and then many barriers towards people getting the treatments they desire? So I think the question of what the research we need has to go back to some extent to the people themselves, and the questions that trans people. The thing is that I've already made my statement that the trans community itself is enormously diverse. So the kind of questions. I showed this to several trans, gender diverse, gender queer colleagues just because I do, and people were really interested and alive to these kind of issues. Other people would see it as deeply prejudicial. I think. There's a lot of rhetoric about the idea of a biological explanation for atypical studies, research. And as I hinted, I think it's often a matter of be careful what you wish for, that you start going down that road and actually there are other motivations that are sucked into play then. So I don't have an answer to your question about what are the best areas of research to go into. I suppose the research that we've just got a very big grant from the National Institute of Health Research for, is simply to track these young people, to hear from young people themselves what they make of this. And obviously we know after 4 or 5 years, I'm talking about 10, 20, 30 years down the line, what's the life history now of doing some of these alterations? I think until we've got a substantial body of understanding about how people are telling their own stories of body transformation. I mean, I had some bits at the end of how I was going to say that I think in some ways the future will either be a pulling back, I mean, both socially, clinically, pulling back from some of this work. People are going to get more and more alarmed about the ethics of this work, and there'll be a pullback from it. The medical interventions, I mean, and the entitlements to live this way, or possibly more likely a step forward, if you like, into greater availability of safe, assured medical interventions that can be acquired without necessarily much oversight by people like me, psychologists, in which the alteration of the body, which we already do through so many medications that we take. How many tablets have been taken by people this morning, before breakfast? That this is the way we're moving in a wealthy society, that people will do more and more to alter the body they were born into, and those rights will be enshrined for them. So I think we could see it both going in different ways.
One final question, please.
So hopefully I can keep it brief, but I just had a question. I mean, obviously you said it's a very diverse kind of community and probably diverse set of phenotypes and actually developmental histories. But I was just wondering, I mean, if a cause is identified in an individual, if a cause is identified for gender dysphoria in an individual, whether that be a biological, I mean, I think that would probably be very difficult because it would probably be complicated, but biological, developmental, and then a therapy was envisaged for such a cause, what would the kind of justification be for taking a position on gender reassignment versus that therapy, in helping that person deal with their dysphoria to remain in their gender reassigned sex versus transitioning, as a result of that dysphoria, which may be treated in a way. I was just wondering about if there's any.
Well, you can wonder, and it sounds as though you're overhearing many debates that we have in the clinic about just this. And in particular, touching on Hayley's presentation about the role of complex trauma in the lives of these young people. That's probably the biggest and most difficult debate that we have at the moment. Not just do we have evidence that these young people. Yes, but if you take a sample of teenagers who come to CAMS clinics and who are brought by their parents with gender identity disorder, many of them there'll be some suggestion, or we might think, using our little antennae, that there may have been complex trauma in the past. Now, I was thinking about this quite a lot when Hayley was speaking. If there's no suffering there, if they feel this is completely consonant with their wishes to now identify as male, having been female, and they wish to have these things, what is our responsibility as people with an emancipatory mindset about our work to go on challenging that? I mean, conversion therapy is now banned, so clearly we're not going down that route. But we do have young people who, if we can hold them and they're interested, and if I might say, have a particular curiosity about themselves and their own journey to this point, yes, they will work with us, and they may come out, after many sessions and time has elapsed and so on, and many life experiences, feeling they don't want to pursue this route. And a not unfamiliar story, and this we're about to publish a paper on this, is young people who come absolutely certain and determined that this is for them. And then they begin to think differently, even because because they identify as non-binary, they don't really want the physical interventions. Or some of them would say, it was during that period when I was so depressed and so anxious, and this and this and this had happened. I felt this would be the answer. I felt I would be transformed, and now I no longer think that. So these are really, really pressing clinical and ethical issues, the extent to which, without doing anything like conversion therapy, we have responsibility to say we've had enough, small numbers, but enough young people to think that, some elements of psychotherapy will see them through. Going alongside them will see them through to a different outcome. Yeah.
So, as well as our speakers, I would like to thank all of you for your attentiveness, patience, and contribution. Thank you very much.